Hi, this is Andrew Marty from SACS, and the subject matter today is leadership in a distributed workforce. What we're going to do in this presentation is take you through what the research evidence says about what works in leading a distributed workforce.
So before getting into the material of the presentation, what I wanted to do is to set the scene somewhat. And to set the scene, let's look at some statistics about the amount of working from home that takes place. So this data is from the Roy Morgan Research Group, and you'll see that the data is time signatured from January 2010 to January 2020. Quite substantial samples used to get this data. And what you discover is that the data is actually surprisingly stable. From 10 years of development, the amount of working from home, or the percentage of people reporting that they do some work from home, increased by only 1%. Now, of course, January 2020, just after January 2020, a rather significant event happened, a thing called COVID-19. And right now, you really can't get good data about how many people are working from home. I hunted around everywhere, so I'm making this presentation in June 2020, and right now there doesn't seem to be really reliable data. There are various estimates, but they vary extremely widely. But we presume, well, we don't presume, we know that the percentage of people working from home will have exploded under these circumstances. But about a third of Australians do some work from home, according to their responses to this Roy Morgan survey. If we look at the United States of America, what we see is that currently it's claimed that about 16% of people there, so a lower percentage, work from home. And this more than doubled between 2005 to 2015, which is a slower start, but much quicker growth. In other words, working from home doesn't appear to be as prevalent in the United States of America, but it seems to be growing extremely rapidly. So this really raises the question of when the COVID-19 issue resolves itself, will there be a new normal? And many organisations are saying there will be a new normal. So people were concerned about working from home, and certainly at SACS we've found that remote work works fantastically for us. I mean, over the past 3 or 4 years we went through very significant technology transformations to make everything cloud-based, and that has stood us in very good stead to work remotely. And so many people's concerns about this have evaporated. They found actually it works pretty well. Now, most organisations right now are under some form of financial pressure and don't want to pay rent. And of course, having people working from home allows you to have less rental property. And as we all know, mass commuting is an environmental, public health and lifestyle nightmare. So in cities all over the world, literally hundreds of millions of people undertake a daily migration from their home to go to work. Now, if you think of this in a purely cognitive, a purely rational form, is that a good thing? Well, many people don't like their commutes. Many people don't feel that it adds to their lifestyle. And of course, from a public health point of view, I mean, one of the things that everybody's very concerned about is going back to the normal kind of office environment will pose enormous risks in transport. I mean, the whole idea of community transmission of disease when everybody's jammed together on a train is, of course, a bad thing. And of course, the technologies have developed which have made it much easier for even small companies to buy into products which are really application service provider type products, where you don't have to invest enormously heavily. You can buy access or even get it free from something like Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever. And so we're technologically more ready. And so there are multiple tales of companies shrinking or abandoning offices. Several of our clients have told us that they've had leases come up and they're simply not releasing floors that they had in capital cities around Australia and New Zealand. So they're simply deciding, all right, well, we're going to work from home. So that will be the new normal, more people working from home because people have realised it just isn't necessary to be in the office. Now, this really raises a question, is it a good thing for employees to work from home? And of course, the answer is yes, it is a good thing. And Golden and Gajendran in 2019 found that if you do technical work or if you do work that requires concentration, it's easier to concentrate at home than it is in the office. There are less distractions many times. Now, obviously, there are some homes which are not set up for working from home. And yes, you might have more distraction, but on balance, in quite substantial surveys, employees reported that they could concentrate more effectively from home. Slightly higher engagement. I mean, this varies from study to study, but Allen et al. Found in 2015 that there was slightly higher engagement, less stress and exhaustion. By the way, all the references are given at the back of this presentation, so you'll have a chance to see those if you want a copy of the slides. Productivity has been found to be as good or better and higher organisational citizenship behaviour. Now, what Gajendran was talking about in this 2015 article, organisational citizenship behaviour is people doing things that they don't have to do to keep their jobs. Maybe they're going to respond to an email out of hours. Maybe they're going to do something generous for a customer or something like that. So you get better organisational citizenship behaviours when people are working from home. Now, I guess the other question is that necessarily a good thing if people answer emails out of hours? From a productivity point of view, you can't call it a bad thing, but it may be a lifestyle issue. And of course, there are some things that are worse about working from home. So blurred boundaries around work and family, and this is probably one of the most reported negatives. You know, when am I actually off? And some people's families have said, well, actually, you know, there used to be a clearer delineation between work and home when you worked in an office. One of the things we also know, and as you can see, Gajendran is a sort of a specialist in this work from home stuff, worse relationships with colleagues if you don't spend enough time in the office. And so what Gajendran and Harrison found is that if you spend more than about 3 days a week working remotely, many employees did report a decline in the relationship with their colleagues. Not surprisingly, face-to-face contact is important for building those relationships. And one of the things that's really important is that some people are not suited to an environment of less interaction. And I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in just a moment. But one of the things that we know is that some people are suited to remote work and some people are very unsuited to remote work. So the objectives of this presentation, we're going to talk about the challenges of distributed leadership. We're going to talk about what makes a staff member suited to remote work. I mean, what types of staff members are suited and what are unsuited. Engagement and remote work. We're going to talk about engagement. Engagement is a really important measure of well-being and productivity, and it varies. Some people are more engaged when they work remotely. Some people are less engaged, and that's an important consideration. And we're going to talk about what you can do to maximize engagement in remote workers. And we're going to say it comes down to two things. One is to recruit for it, recruit people who are suited to it. And secondly, to lead for it, which is to say, provide a form of leadership that's going to work better. And we're going to give you lots of tips and techniques for distributed leadership in the course of this presentation. So firstly, the question, what types of people are suited to remote work? If you're going to lead a remote workforce, you have to know what types of people are suited to remote work. And so we think there's two factors. Well, it's not just us. At SACS, the world's organizational psychology research demonstrates that there are two factors that you need to consider. One is the person's well-being. And you might call that a positive psychology perspective. Is the person engaged in their work? Are they resilient? Is their resilience improving? In other words, is remote working causing their resilience to improve or decline? And will this person continue to grow? Now, we don't mean that in a philosophical sense necessarily. We're talking about grow in terms of their skills, their career, their relationships with other people, their growth as a professional. And the second component is, of course, productivity. So counterproductive work behaviours. Now, one of the things that we do know is that counterproductive work behaviours in large populations of employees increase when you don't have the observation of a supervisor. In other words, certain people who might not do bad things, counterproductive work behaviours really is doing bad things, and the counterproductive work behaviours tend to come in two flavours. Flavour number one is bad things to the organisation, and that might be taking sick days when you're not really sick, or it could be things like saying bad things about your employer. And then the second flavour is doing bad things to colleagues. So that's bullying, harassment, snubbing, ignoring, those kinds of things. Now, we know that in the absence of supervision, some people do more bad things than they would in the presence of supervision. And then you have something that's quite heavily researched called cyber slacking or cyber loafing, which is where people are really surfing the web or watching YouTube videos which have nothing to do with work when they're supposed to be working. And of course, many organizations have become very concerned about cyber slacking and cyber loafing. And yeah, some people do cyber slack or cyber loaf. So we need to talk about what types of indicators there are as to the sort of person who is likely to do those bad things. And the second is this person ready to work remotely? So some people are in their various stages of their career more suited to working remotely than at other stages in their career. And this is a very old model. You see Hersey and Blanchard from 1982. This is a thing that they called situational leadership. And basically the idea is that when a person joins a role for the first time, they have low competence, then they have low to some competence, then they have moderate to high competence, then they have high competence. And the style of leadership that works for them in those various circumstances varies. So if a person is low competence, in other words, they've just taken up a job, what you need is high directive and low supportive behavior. Supportive behavior being things like delegation, make up your own mind, empowerment, those kinds of things. And so what this suggests very strongly is that if a person is brand new to a job, then it may be more difficult for them to work remotely than, let's say, if they are very mature in their job, so high competence and high commitment. And so they're going to need low directive and low supportive behavior. And those, they can pretty much be just allowed to go on with what they do. So the stage of development is, of course, important to whether somebody's suited to working remotely. Now, then there's a question of whether the person is intrinsically suited to working remotely. And here are some indicators of whether somebody is likely to be suited to remote work. One of the things that we know, so this is the SACS assessment for remote work, and what we know is that cognitive ability has an effect of driving whether a person's likely to be able to work remotely. So we've set some scores based on research for people having an acceptable level of cognitive ability. Now, you can imagine somebody's been tested, sample candidate's been tested. These green ticks mean that sample candidate has these characteristics. There are 35 plus for abstract reasoning, 35 for numerical reasoning. By the way, this goes on the front of a more complete psychological assessment report. And when you look inside, you'd be able to see exactly what sample candidate scores are on abstract, numerical, and verbal reasoning. So it would appear that sample candidate is smart enough to work remotely. Because one of the things that we know is that if you are smart, you tend to be able to act more independently and not need so much direct supervision. Then you have resilience. And so what we're saying is that this person, 40, by the way, means it's still below population average, but what it means is that this person's resilience is not terrible. And what that means is that the person should be resilient enough to work remotely. This is a value, and the value of autonomy says that this person believes that it's a good thing to work autonomously. It doesn't need to have other people to make his or her decision. And so in that sense, the person should be comfortable to work autonomously because he or she believes that it's an appropriate way to work. You see that we have absence of anger. Angry people don't work so well remotely. And so here we've got a 46 plus. Now this person's not ticking the box there, but overall we're saying, hey, there are so many positives about this person. Don't knock them out for remote work, but you might like to explore how angry this person is. Conscientiousness, so this person is a conscientious person. So it means that they are likely to keep trying hard when they're working remotely. You see this characteristic called integrity modesty. What this means is that this person is likely to be an honest person and not arrogant. And that's important because it's a predictor of honesty type behaviors. And that's an indicator of things like cyber slacking, cyber loafing, taking advantage. Openness to experience. The reason that that gets a run here is that there is research evidence that when people work remotely, it's a good thing for them to be sort of broad-minded and able to take in new ways of doing things. Because especially if you start working remotely, the difficulty that you have is that you're going to have to start using technologies maybe that you haven't so much used in the past, doing things in a different way from how you've done them in the past. So being open-minded is important. Now, sadly, this individual doesn't tick that box, but as I said earlier, they tick a lot of boxes. And so you would say on balance, they're probably suited to working remotely, although the openness to experience bit may be worth exploring. Emotionality. One of the things that we know is that people who are emotionally unstable tend to struggle to work remotely, largely because people who are emotionally unstable are people who tend to need more support from leaders and colleagues. And so emotionality, when emotionality is high, that means a person is emotionally unstable. And when emotionality is low, that means that they are emotionally stable and resilient. So 60 and below, we're saying that's a cut score for emotionality. And finally, extroversion. Now, the 65 is really quite a high score. So we're setting not a very hard barrier for people to jump there. But what we're saying is that people who are extreme extroverts, there is research evidence that they struggle to work remotely for two reasons. One is that they like the company of colleagues and they enjoy the day-to-day contact with colleagues. But as well as that, what we find is that people who are extreme extroverts may be more easily distracted by, let's say, going down the coffee shop rather than to undertaking the work that they're doing. They can, under certain circumstances, be more inclined to cyber loafing because extroverts like watching YouTube videos, for instance. Anything that gives them an opportunity to expose or to experience contact with other people, that's a good thing. Now, on balance, we say, okay, well, there are some pluses and minuses in this person, but on balance, we're saying that this person is suited to working remotely. So there are some characteristics. They need to be smart enough. They need to be resilient enough because they've got to pick themselves up when things go wrong. They need to believe to a certain extent in autonomy. It's a good thing if they're not overly angry. It's good if they're conscientious and hardworking. It's good if they're honest, which is the integrity modesty thing. It's good if they're broad-minded enough. It's good if they're emotionally stable. And it's good if they're not extreme extroverts, because extreme extroverts will struggle to be by themselves and may be easily distracted from their work under those circumstances. Now, so you've recruited somebody who is suited to remote working, or you may have assessed your existing employees if you're trying to decide in the new normal who should work remotely and who should be in the office. You've assessed the ones who are suited to working remotely, but then you have to keep them engaged when working remotely, because even though there is evidence that engagement stays around about the same, or some indicate slightly higher levels of engagement, some people will have declining engagement when they go remote. And so let's talk about why that happens. But firstly, let's give you a definition of engagement. This is the definition of engagement that we use at SACS. This is an evidence-based definition, article getting a little old now, but still very powerful definition of engagement. Baker and a gentleman by the name of Demaruti in 2011 undertook what's called a meta-analysis. They reanalyzed a whole bunch of research into engagement, and they defined engagement as having three characteristics. Vigor means energy. I am energetic at work, and I am mentally resilient in work. Energy and mental resilience are hand in hand. Second, dedication, which means I'm committed. I'm strongly involved in my work. My work has a sense of significance, and I believe it's really important. People who are highly dedicated try to get better at what they do. The third component is where people are absorbed in their work. And what that means is absorption is the characteristic of being fully concentrated and engrossed in your work. Time passes quickly. Now, at an individual level, this is often called flow. And you'll see that in our measure, we actually call this flow, because flow can appear or can work at an individual level, but also at a work group level. Now, absorption is when people come to work, they get immersed in their work group, time flows quickly, they're happily engrossed, they're enjoying their work, and it's satisfying. They don't have to apply themselves very hard, they get automatically absorbed in their work. Now, if you look at these three characteristics, one of the things that I like to do when I encourage people to think about this, imagine if all your employees came to work, they were energetic, they were dedicated, and they got happily lost in their work, happily engrossed in their work. And so they don't have time flows and they look up and, hey, where did this day go? That's a great situation for people to be in. Now, the business case for engagement and the business case for this particular definition of engagement, and this is one of the reasons why this definition has become a dominant definition, not just in the world of psychological research, but also in the world of management. The business case is pretty clear. Productivity varies with increases and decreases in engagement. Internal measures such as job satisfaction, absenteeism, traction, retention, all of those sorts of things will vary with engagement. So the higher the engagement, the less absenteeism that you get, the less staff turnover you get. There's a bunch of things that are internal measures. But also we know that when you have high levels of engagement, you get better outcomes in terms of external measures like profit, income growth. A gentleman by the name of Daniel Dennison some years ago was able to predict the growth of companies on the US stock exchange by measuring the levels of engagement within their workforces. And one of the things that we know is that customer satisfaction varies with engagement. So 50 to 60% of causation means that if you ring a customer service person on a call center, let's say, if that person is highly engaged in their work, that engagement is a 50% to 60% cause of your satisfaction. Two separate surveys. We survey the levels of engagement of the staff member, we survey the customer satisfaction, and we find such a strong correlation that 50 to 60% of the satisfaction of the person calling the call center is determined by the levels of engagement of the staff member. By the way, this also applies to sales teams. So sales teams that are heavily engaged tend to sell much more than disengaged sales teams. Occupational health and safety. Highly engaged workforces are safer workforces. So it's a really good predictor of organizational outcomes. And that's why organizations around the world are very keen on engagement, irrespective of whether they're commercial or not-for-profits. It's an important thing. So what causes engagement? Well, there are some individual characteristics, and that is to say that your recruitment practices will have a big impact on your levels of engagement. And so this is the results of a study where we assessed the levels of engagement using an internationally validated tool. We assessed the levels of engagement of about 800, 900 people. This is a study we did a couple of years ago. And these were people who had prior completed our psych tests. So there were people who applied for jobs, and we went to our database of people who completed psych tests, and we said, can you fill in an engagement survey? And as I say, about 800 or something of them did that. So these are personality measures. This is a thing called the Hexaco model of personality, otherwise known as a Big Six model of personality: honesty, humility, emotionality, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, openness to experience. So SACS is involved in what is known as the scientist practitioner model of service provision. We undertake research. Our main research partner is Deakin University. We undertake research into organizational psychology. We seek publications, but then we use these findings to develop products which our clients use. Now, that's personality. Personality is quite heavily genetically determined. People estimate it's between, let's say, 75 to 50% genetically determined. You'll get different reads on that. Values, on the other hand, are largely learned in the course of life. This doesn't tend to change that much in the course of life for most people. This changes quite markedly because if we move to another country or we go to a different social group, we will start to soak up their values, and our values will change. So what we're saying, this adjusted R-squared here, so this is a strong correlation, but the adjusted R-squared says that about 30% of people's engagement comes to them before they walk in through your front door. It's based on their personality and their values. Values can change, but they tend to be quite stable over the course of life, depending on what you experience. So if you move to another country, your values will change quite a bit. But if you stay in pretty much the same social group throughout your life, your values will remain relatively stable, although some of them may change just based on personal experience and your life stage as well. So 30% is a lot. Just to talk about that in comparison with other components of recruitment, the best interviews ever constructed seem to be about 25% accurate. So that's accurate. So that's not as good as 30%. Reference checks seem to be about 7% accurate. So 30% is a lot. Now, what predicts whether people are likely to be engaged? Firstly, so these beta weights are measures of strength of relationship. Diligence, which means hardworking, energetic people, tend to be more engaged than people who are, shall we say, a little bit more relaxed or lazy about their work. Liveliness. So what that means is that people who are chirpy, cheerful, optimistic tend to be more engaged naturally than people who are, shall we say, negative, pessimistic, or cynical. People who are not greedy tend to be more engaged than people who are greedy. Conformity is all about having respect for rules. Conformity is kind of a slightly misleading name, I think, for this value. So this is the Schwartz value of conformity. The value of conformity is about respecting rules, not being about sheepishly obedient to whatever you are told. Conformity is more about, I respect rules. I think that rules are important. And in fact, conformity in general is a positive thing. People who are high in conformity are better at teamwork. Social boldness is about feeling confident in the presence of other people. So that's an extroversion characteristic. And altruism, which is a personality characteristic under the SACS, under the Hexaco, is altruism is all about making sure or being soft-hearted, caring for other people. So I think this paints a picture of cheerful, optimistic people who are kind of generous and who respect the rules. They are the types of people who are more likely to be engaged. They are also good people to send remote, because some of the other characteristics that we have here, diligence and liveliness, we know are drivers of resilience as well. So people are likely to be resilient. So here's an example of where this is our assessment to measure whether somebody is likely to be engaged in their work. So if you recruit people, now obviously this person doesn't score all that well in respect of engagement on the way in. So you can predict whether people are likely to be engaged on the way in. So it's a good thing to recruit people who are inclined to be engaged, not just if they're going to work remotely, of course, but more generally as well. So then there's a bunch of work-related stuff. So you've recruited people who are suited to be engaged in their work, but then there's work-related stuff which affects their levels of engagement. And so this is a diagram. This is a distillation of an article from Peter Cotton and Peter Hart in 2011, where they talk about the fact that culture is not really corporate. We use the term corporate culture all the time, but it's kind of misleading, because if you look at the factors that affect people's levels of engagement at work and their well-being at work, 80% of it comes from their immediate job, team, and leader. And my favorite expression to describe this is that if you are in a bad team in a wonderful organization, you are in hell. If you are in a wonderful team in an awful organization, you're in heaven. The local environment is vastly more important to people than the corporate environment. Now, organizational factors can influence, of course, the local environment. So if you've got good policies and the senior executive sponsors support for these teams and sponsors the development of good leadership and good teamwork and those sorts of things, of course, that will help. And good leaders cascade their behaviors lower in the organization. But there's a couple of really important messages here. You can make things better in your own work group, irrespective of the organization. Some people feel disempowered in their own work group, but with the right leader, the right team, and the right work, you can make your work life much, much better and have higher levels of engagement and well-being. So that's an important message. The second message is that some organizations are developing policies and processes about working remotely. And you know what? They are going to be only a slight proportion of the solution, because the real solution is teaching leaders how to lead in a remote working environment. Now, you'll notice these terms proximal and distal. Proximal is things that are close to me. Distal is things that are far away from me. My job, my team, and my leader are proximal because I am immersed in them every day I go to work. The organization, on the other hand, is a kind of a concept, isn't it? It's not really something that exists. Yuval Noah Harari has written often about the fact that an organization is in fact a kind of a concept. It's a myth, as he describes it. And it's a real myth in the sense that organizations do stuff, but we have to all believe in an organization in order for it to exist. So that's a concept. This stuff I experience on a day-to-day basis. In psychology, the proximal stuff works, the distal stuff doesn't. That is, by the way, why many initiatives such as mission, vision, and values statements don't work, because they don't reach into the local team environment to change what goes on in the person's day-to-day work life. So here's a piece of research that we undertook some years ago. This research was undertaken in the initial form with Deakin University, and we got a number of publications out of this. But what we want to talk about here is that, again, this is similar to what I showed you with the personality factors. We measured the levels of engagement. This was about 2,700 people across Australia and New Zealand. We measured their levels of engagement using the tool I mentioned earlier, a thing called the Utrecht Work Engagement Scale, which is an internationally validated measure of engagement. But we worked with a gentleman by the name of Emil Breidel, who undertook a literature review about all of the factors that were found to drive engagement. And yes, some of them were job characteristics, some of them were team characteristics, some of them were leader characteristics, and some of them were organization characteristics. Now, what you see here, these 5 things about the job and the 6 things about the team and the 10 things about leadership and the organizational characteristics here, this is a distillation of many more. In other words, once we got all this data, we then undertook statistical analysis, and we found, for instance, 5 job characteristics, 10 leadership characteristics, which were mathematically most important and which explained engagement most effectively. Now, we're covering 64% of the engagement of these 2,700 employees. Bear in mind, we didn't really look at what organization they worked for. And yes, there were personality factors that were at play here, and then cognitive ability factors and all of those sorts of things which affect people's levels of engagement. But 64% is a lot of people's engagement, and people who know about correlations know that a multiple correlation is of 0.8 is a very big correlation. So this study worked. We were able to predict a lot of people's engagement by understanding these factors. And so SACS has used this to develop an engagement measurement instrument, and we measure these characteristics to help organizations understand what they need to do to improve their engagement. Are they job characteristics? Are they team characteristics? Are they leader characteristics? Or are they organizational characteristics that need to be solved? Now, one of the things that we can show you here is that this diagram gives you the beta weights, that strength of association of these things with engagement. And you'll notice I color-coded, or I put an initial, J for job, L for leader, T for team. And one of the things that you'll notice is that there are no O for organizational things in the top predictors of engagement here. And why? Well, because my job, my team, and my leader are much more important. And so what we're doing in this study is validating what Peter Cotton and Peter Hart found all that time ago. And what we found is that these key things here, learning at work, optimism about your job, in other words, I feel that my job is getting better, I have self-confidence in doing my job, my work has a high degree of variety. Variety at work is very important for people. We know that if people do the same stuff day after day after day, they're much less likely to be engaged. So one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, under these circumstances, these remote working circumstances, are people still learning at work? I mean, this is a useful checklist, isn't it? If you want people to be highly engaged, have they sacrificed their learning by virtue of working remotely? And I think the answer for some people is no, and the answer for some people is yes. Some people, we know that being immersed with your colleagues, you get this kind of what's called osmotic form of learning. Seeing and hearing them gives you learnings. Are they optimistic about where their job is going? And so if I feel that I still have a career path and I still have an opportunity for my work to get better and more interesting, well, I'm much more likely to be engaged in a remote setting. If that's fallen off, then I'm likely to lessen my engagement. Do I have self-confidence? Well, we know that some people feel confident to work remotely. I mean, think back to situational leadership. If I'm brand new in the job and I'm still finding my way, my self-confidence is much more likely to be low in a remote situation than if I'm experienced and seasoned in my job. And the variety of work. If the variety of work has increased, in other words, I'm doing more varied stuff, then I'm much more likely to remain engaged than if I have given that away. Leaders, we're talking about the leader creating a learning environment. Is the leader, now, people always ask me about this negative beta weight. Don't worry about that. That's a statistical artifact. It's a thing called the suppressor variable. The correlation between creates a learning environment and engagement is a positive correlation. The beta weights can go negative for reasons of intercorrelation. Sorry, I don't want to bore you with stats, but trust me, leaders who create a learning environment tend to have more engaged staff. Then the team characteristics. Am I optimistic about where my team is going? Are things improving in respect of how my team is working together? Do we have clarity of goals? Now, one of the things that we know is that in remote working, it can be more difficult to have clarity of goals. Is there good recognition of performance in my team when I'm working remotely? Those are characteristics that we can also focus on to increase levels of engagement when working remotely. So let's look at some leadership characteristics, because one of the things I will show you later on is that leadership is an incredibly powerful driver of engagement. And we know that whilst there's only one L there, further modeling that we did showed that the behavior of the leader does affect this, not surprisingly, because the leader, of course, allocates tasks, splits jobs up, asks people to do work, maybe takes work off some people and gives it to others. So not surprisingly, that affects people's satisfaction with their work and their levels of engagement. Also, the guidance of an effective leader affects people's self-confidence. The team, the behaviours of a leader cascade into the team, so that affects whether people are likely to be seeing good behaviours in their team. And of course, all of these are the leader behaviours that matter. And so, the message of this slide, we want to give you one really important message, and that is that these are the 4 leader behaviours that matter most. Encourages autonomous decision-making is empowering. This is where people are encouraging staff to make their own decisions, individually or as a group, about how something should be done. I'm going to talk to you in just a moment about a thing called facilitative leadership, where a leader acts as a facilitator rather than a boss. Encourages autonomous decision-making is all about empowering people. And the message here is that this is the single most powerful thing that a leader can do to improve engagement. The second is about being optimistic and positive. Leadership is really not for negative, cynical, pessimistic people. Now, when we talk about optimism and positivity, I don't mean a kind of a cockeyed optimism. Don't worry, everything's going to be fine. There are no problems. That's not what we're talking about. Optimism in this case is what a gentleman by the name of Albert Bandura, who was a psychologist who published on this decades ago, he called it self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is a belief that I can cope, a belief that I will be able to do this stuff. Now that can, of course, be individual, but we know that certain teams have self-efficacy, don't we? Some teams have a self-confidence that they can get something done. Supportive leadership. Again, we have a negative beta weight. Don't worry about that. Supportive leadership does correlate positively with engagement. Leaders who are supportive are people who are providing individual human support to staff. Yeah, don't worry, you can go into the dentist or to your daughter's birthday party or whatever. But it's also being supportive in terms of career development. Yeah, I'll help you to build your skills. I will help you to get your next promotion, those kinds of things. And finally, creates a learning environment. And you saw on the previous slide that one of the most powerful things for engagement overall is learning at work. So not surprisingly, leaders who create a learning environment have higher levels of engagement. Now, this all, of course, raises the question about how to do this, and we're going to give you some specific tips about how to do this. Now, you can assess this stuff, and I'm certainly finding that a number of our clients are interested in 360-degree feedback at the moment, because we've just said that encouraging autonomous decision-making, in other words, empowerment, is one of the key drivers of people's levels of engagement. And so, interesting profile, this person believes a little bit less than population average, 50 is population average. About population average, they perceive that they are effective in empowering. The person's leader believes that they're about average, and indirect reports believe they're about average. But look at this, the direct reports think, no, this person's really good at empowering us. So there's something that this person is doing that other people aren't seeing, including the indirect reports. And you also see a comment, there's a comment here, which was anonymized from a genuine 360-degree feedback process. So let's get a little bit more specific about the type of leadership that works particularly well in remote settings. And we're going to talk about transformational leadership. This has been spoken about often in research, and we're going to simplify transformational leadership into a technique that we call facilitative leadership, and I'm going to give you some specific tips about that type of leadership. So Pervanova and Bono defined in 2009 this idea of a transformational leader. So idealized influence. Now, this sounds very conceptual. Please forgive this, but there is good empirical research about transformational leadership and working remotely, which is why we want to use this concept. But we will subsequently link this to a thing called facilitative leadership, which sort of simplifies how you do it. So idealized influence is where leaders are kind of doing the right stuff. They're purpose driven. So they believe in the purpose of whatever the organization's goal is. They lead by example. So that means that, okay, we have a meeting at 8:30. I am there. I'm the leader. I am there. We're purpose driven. Okay, so we're an organization that's, I don't know, working to assist people with disability to live a life full of independence, let's say. That's purpose driven. But so is, hey, we make plastic coat hangers and we make really good plastic coat hangers. That's purpose driven as well. The charisma bit, well, if you're lucky enough to have charisma, which seems to be, by the way, extremely heavily genetically determined, training courses to teach people to be charismatic haven't really been that effective. Well, focus on, if you don't happen to be lucky enough to have charisma in lashings, focus on being purpose-driven and leading by example, because people can do that. Inspirational motivation is about articulating a vision, defining goals, motivating and inspiring, and being optimistic. We already talked about the power of optimism, and setting a strategy, setting a clarity of where we want to go. In facilitative leadership, we would say the best way of doing this is to facilitate the team to have a very active role in this, because whatever the vision is there, they will be part of that vision and they will own it if they've been part of its formation. Intellectual stimulation is really about encouraging people to learn, encouraging people to be creative, encouraging people to be flexible. So there's a real learning component there. In other words, people are less engaged if their work is boring and if their environment is boring. We don't have to make it boring. Even work which is relatively proceduralized and routine can be made more empowering and more interesting. Individualized consideration, supportive, encouraging. So this is where we're talking about supportive leadership before. So you see that this charismatic, transformational leadership style is really quite heavily linked to the characteristics that we identified back here in these 4 characteristics and some of these others. So things like effective management of behaviours, clarity about performance standards, clarity about appropriate behaviours, celebrating success, they link very well with transformational leadership. So let's show you some of the research from transformational leadership and what was found. This is a big study in 2008, Neufeld, Won and Fang, and this is a diagram which describes their findings. What they discovered is that where people did this style of leadership, this I will show the way kind of leadership, this I will support you kind of leadership, I will create clarity, or we will create clarity about what is effective performance. What they found was that people who undertook transformational leadership had higher perceived leader performance. In other words, the staff thought that their leader was doing a better job. And the interesting thing about this study is that this was all with remote employees. And in fact, what Neufeld, Won and Fang discovered is that transformational leadership was more important in remote workplaces than in workplaces where everybody sat together. So a transformational leader is perceived by remote staff to be better than a leader who is not transformational. Also, transformational leadership led to a perception of communication effectiveness. Communication effectiveness then subsequently contributing to perceived leader performance. We know that leaders who communicate effectively tend to be seen as more effective by staff, but transformational leadership kind of contributes to communication. Contingent reward leadership is where leaders are making it clear to people what needs to be achieved and then congratulating them when they achieve those things. So, hey, that's a great job, thank you very much. That, of course, not surprisingly, contributed to communication effectiveness. But the interesting thing that all this says is that transformational leadership is a great thing in any workplace, but it seems to be more important in a remote workplace. Now, I'm going to simplify this whole concept because having to be all of these things can be a little confusing. So this is a diagram which simplifies. Now, of course, it is a simplification. It simplifies leadership. And really what we're saying here is that there is a continuum from being top down. So the blue dot is the boss. This is a boss style of relationship. I will tell you what to do. Now, of course, good leaders need to be able to do this. You cannot be somebody who, when a staff member turns up for their first day of work, says, well, what do you want to do? Good leaders satisfy their employees by saying, this is what you do. And if you think back to situational leadership, This is a situation where you need to say to the person, hey, this is your job, this is your induction process, here's how you're going to learn, here's the colleagues that you need to work with. That's top-down leadership. At the other end of the spectrum, you have a thing called facilitative leadership. Facilitative leadership is where the leader doesn't necessarily make the decision. True facilitative leadership is where the leader doesn't make the decision. The leader facilitates a process where the staff makes the decision. The best way of doing facilitative leadership is through small group activities. So I could fit only 5 dots in this diagram, but this surround here says these people are together. Now they can be together physically, or they could be together in a Zoom or Microsoft Teams meeting or something like that. But if you use Zoom, one of the things that you may have experienced, Zoom has fantastic facilities for breakout rooms. And we've done a lot of facilitative leadership interactions with clients by virtue of using Zoom. There's a plug for Zoom for you. And it's really good for things like setting up these small group activities. The small group activities are very powerful in facilitative leadership because we described people's different personalities. If I'm highly introverted and I get put into a group of, let's say, 3 people, I'm far more likely to have a conversation with that group of 3 people than I am to have a conversation with the entire room. So what's a really good activity if you're doing facilitative leadership? Hey, we've got to solve this problem. Send people off into small groups to discuss the problem and then come back and somebody reports back from each group. And then a true facilitative leader might say, all right, well, we've heard everybody's perspective on this. Let's take a vote about what we're going to do. And the vote will then determine what the decision is. So a true facilitative leader is somebody who is skilled at knowing when to be top down. Consultation is when I ask people their opinion and go back to my office and make my own mind up. By the way, the challenge is if you use consultation as your only form of leadership, what you may find is that if you do something which is contrary to what somebody else has previously suggested, they may well believe that you've just done this. You were just pretending to consult me. Whereas facilitative leadership demonstrates that you are taking the view of the group and you are using the view of the group. That's true facilitative leadership. So the distributed leadership challenge. Well, I talked to you earlier about the fact that proximal work, whereas distal doesn't. Now, remote employees are distal. You've got a social context versus social isolation. The work group, of course, is a social context. And then people are isolated. They're sitting by themselves in their kitchen or their study or their whatever. And you've got occasional contact versus regular contact. And so you don't have those accidental contacts that happen around the workplace when you bump into somebody or you turn around in your desk and you say to somebody, well, look, we should do this or whatever. So the challenge that you have is the distance can become the norm. And one of the things that I found in interacting with clients, people are worried that they're losing their culture by virtue of distance. And that is a risk, no question about it. People who have distributed workforces have reported this for years, where, this group of 5 people out in this rural and regional location, they have their own culture, which is quite different from what people have in the city in the work groups, let's say. That can become the norm. It can be appropriate or it can be inappropriate, depending on what you're trying to achieve as an organization. One of the things that leaders have to be very conscious of, though, is that occasional contacts can become very significant. So you speak to an employee 3 times a week. They're working from home. You speak to them 3 times a week. One of those interactions is something that the employee doesn't like, or it makes them nervous, or they get the impression that maybe you disapprove of something that they've done. They don't raise it at the time. If you are working with them in the same office and you bump into them and you smile at them, it can be sometimes to cancel that negative effect. But leaders have to be much more conscious of the fact that occasional contact can have a very big impact on the morale and well-being of employees. And so those interactions can become very significant. We should all learn that corporate culture is purely and simply the ratio of positive versus negative behaviours that you experience in the workplace. That's corporate culture. If I am in a work group where we have lots of positive interactions, we get a positive corporate culture. If I'm in a work group where people are negative, cynical, undermining, pessimistic, gloomy, all of those sorts of things create a negative corporate culture. One of the sad things about human beings, this is a product of evolution, negatives are much more powerful and much more easily remembered than positives. Why? Because in evolutionary terms, a negative thing can kill you. A positive thing typically doesn't make you last longer. It might be enjoyable, but negative things can kill you. Hey, that's a saber-toothed tiger. So we have evolved to become far more alert to negatives than positives. This may well be why every news service runs way more bad news stories than good news stories. Now, it's sometimes estimated that a negative can be worth about 3 to 6 positives, and 3 to 6 depending on the mind state of the person who's hearing this stuff. So if I'm stressed, a negative might be worth 6 positives. What do we mean by that? If you say something negative to somebody, you've got to say 6 positive things just to get them back to where they were before you spoke at all. And you can understand that when you have occasional contact, you may not have the nice, gentle, interpersonal stuff that overcomes any perceived negative interactions. And of course, one of the other things that you lose in a remote situation is you lose this emotional contagion, both for good or ill. So if you've got a negative work group, emotional contagion says that you will have negative emotional impacts by virtue of the fact that the people around you are being negative. But you also lose the positive. If you've got a happy work group, you're losing that. So what does this mean for leaders? There's a number of things that we might recommend. The first, this is the SACS measure of engagement. We're finding a number of organisations are interested in measuring the levels of engagement of their remote employees and measuring it longitudinally. I mean, we can measure levels of engagement with only 3 questions, and we can serve it to people on their phones. So why not consider measuring whether it's going up or going down, depending on the situation or depending on how they're responding to their remote work. So you should recruit for it. You hardworking, optimistic, cheerful and generous people who respect the rules. I mean, that's a pretty good thing to recruit for anyway. And certainly you can assess these things on the way in. So why not consider doing that? But then you've got to lead for it. One of the things that we really recommend is that you plan your interactions with staff. You actually kind of almost create reminders for yourself. Hey, I haven't spoken to Bill Bloggs for the last day. Why is this important? Many remote employees report feeling that they've disappeared. They've fallen off the edge of a cliff. They used to get interactions with their leader, but now they don't. So we should plan our interactions. Do your employees have structure in their week? A lot of employees who've gone remote will say, we used to have a sequence of meetings and interactions. Now it's sort of like the week just starts on Monday sometime and it finishes on Friday sometime, and we don't have a structure or a flow. It's a really good idea for leaders to invent meetings, catch-ups for the entire group as well as individually. We mentioned before the importance of empowerment. Empowerment is important, but in remote situations, not only do you have to empower people, you have to teach them how to be empowered. Because when somebody's sitting in their living room or their study trying to decide what they're going to do, they are intrinsically empowered. So it's a good thing to plan to coach people how to be empowered. And I'll mention a specific technique. Maximize the positive in your interactions with staff. And what I mean by that is that if you've got bad news to give them, hey, this person's done something wrong, you have 2 choices. One is to give them feedback. Neurological studies show that people hate feedback. And as I like to say to people, if you want to test this in real life, walk up to somebody and say, I have some feedback for you, and just watch their nonverbals. People hate feedback. We shouldn't kid ourselves about this. The alternative is feed forward. Feedback is, this is what is wrong with this report. Feed forward is, this is what we need to do in order to make this report good enough to go to a customer. Feed forward is to do with the future. Feedback is to do with the past. Why does this work? What you focus on turns on different parts of your brain. When you use feedback, you turn on the defensive parts of the human brain. When you focus on the future, you turn on the prefrontal cortex, which is the creative learning part of the brain. It's also the part of the brain that manages things like collaboration. So it's a good thing to use feed forward. This is what we need to do in future, rather than harping on what people have done badly in the past. And use facilitative leadership to cause people to team up. And so what we're saying here is that You know, if you do stuff in an office, you're all together in the office, there are 12 of you in an office, we need to do things. Well, people will naturally kind of coalesce. Oh, well, Bill and Jane will do this, Mary and John will do this, Bill, Jane and Mary will do something else. I think what you have to do in remote leadership is you have to cause people to team up. Hey, Bill, Mary and John, let's set up a situation where you guys work together away from me as leader, and we're going to create teamwork consciously, because they may well be lacking that in their remote situation. Now, I think just going back to this proximal distal idea, let's talk about different communication modes. So proximal, you can't get more proximal for human beings than physical contact. So a handshake is a very proximal form of communication. A pat on the back for doing a good job is a very proximal form of communication. On the other hand, at the total opposite end of the spectrum, snail mail, where somebody actually sends somebody a letter. You may have remember these, but bills still come very often like this. But snail mail is about as distal as you could possibly get, because somebody writes something, they put it in a text which is not a human text, they put it in a form of communication which might take several days to get to somebody else. That's really distal. Physical presence, being in the same room, that's really proximal. Speaking to somebody across a partition, that's not the same as actually eyeballing them, but it's pretty proximal. Video conferencing in a small group, so let's say 2, 3, 1 person, that's much more proximal than video conferencing in a large group. So I run a lot of group webinars where you got 150 people, and people are of course distanced from you simply by the fact that you have to interact with a large group. They are, by the very nature of the size of the group, distanced from you. So that's more distal. Teleconversation, one-on-one. Teleconference multiple is more distal. Live chat, conversational. So this is why we're using something like Teams and you're chatting to each other. That's pretty distal. Why? Because you're not getting any non-verbals out of any of these things. Here's my advice for remote leadership. Try to get as high up this as you can. Now, of course, you may not be able to do the first 3 if a person is working remotely. But I guess if you think of some of the earlier studies that we have mentioned, it's a good thing to get people together physically from time to time. So for instance, we work with an organization which has support workers. They're in the aged care sector. They have support workers scattered across the community. They consciously bring groups of these people together at least once a month to run sort of skills development, reflective practice type activities, which those people love. They build their skills, but it reinforces the kind of corporate character, that sort of culture emphasis that people need. But what I'm going to suggest to you is that if you can't do this all the time, try to be at this top end more often. So I'm just about to send an email to somebody. Well, does it really need an email? Maybe you should actually ring them, because that's more proximal than an email. Or maybe you should say, all right, well, why don't we have a Zoom meeting to discuss this? That's more proximal. The more proximal you can be, the more positive impact you're going to have on the well-being of staff. So leadership in remote circumstances, optimism is really important. Encouraging people to make decisions is really important. Being supportive is really important. Coaching and mentoring them is really important. And leading like a facilitator and coach. And the difference between facilitation and coach is very minor. I'm going to say coaching is typically an individual interaction. Facilitation is a group interaction. But you know what? I think a coach can be a good facilitator potentially, because facilitation is really where you're coaching a group. Here's a simple model for coaching an individual or a group. Now, this is based on neuroscience research, and I developed this technique. We're calling it DROP, which is really not a very attractive acronym, but I couldn't come up with a nicer acronym. But it stands for 4 things: destination, reality check, option creation, plan, do, act, and review. So we have made the decision that we're not going to be top down. So Mary Smith comes to us with a challenge. The top down solution would be, well, Mary Smith, you should do this. Goodbye. We've decided that we're going to coach Mary Smith. When Mary Smith comes to us with a challenge, the first thing we want to do with Mary Smith is to say, okay, what is your destination here? And like, that sounds philosophical, but really what we're saying is, what do you really want to achieve here? So Mary Smith says, I'm having difficulties in my relationship with this person. One of the things that we know is that when people need to change or need to learn something new, a clear destination is very powerful. So why don't we ask Mary Smith, what do you want out of this relationship? Look forward 2 months. If you describe the perfect relationship with this person, what would that be like? And Mary Smith, quite often I use 5 words or phrases kind of an activity. Mary Smith might say, well, I want us to be friendly with each other. I want us to be productive colleagues. I want us to get on with other people, whatever comes out. But causing Mary Smith to come up with her own destination teaches her a skill which is extremely useful at an individual level. Now, of course, you can do this with a group as well. You can say, all right, well, we need to do this thing. What does success look like? So we need to improve our customer service. Let's not look at what our complaints are. Let's define what optimum customer service is going to be like. So often a good way of doing that is to say to people, come up with 5 words or phrases that our customers are going to say about us, and then let's pursue that. Reality check, which is the R stage of this equation, is really about an estimate of a couple of things. Firstly, how close are we to the destination? And I like to get people to rate this out of 10. So, I want us to be friendly and productive in our relationship. So where are you now? 10 means perfect. 0 means as bad as possible. 5 is neither good nor bad. And the person might say, well, I think we're a 4. Okay, so that's a reality check. You might also say, how big a deal is this for you? 10 means this is absolutely crucial. 0 means it's totally unimportant. And this person might say a 7. Okay, so it's quite important and you're a long way from your destination. So that's really useful for the person to know, because that will drive how they then behave. Now, the third component of the drop model is option creation. And option creation is where, instead of saying to Mary Smith, you should do X, you should do Y, you should do Z, or instead of saying to the group, you say, all right, well, let's be really creative. What options do we have in front of us? Now, often people come to you with 1 or 2 options, and it's worthwhile coming up with as many as possible creatively, because this will give you an opportunity to then decide which of these options are best. So this is sort of like a brainstorming exercise. Now, in facilitative leadership, I recommend people do this in small group activities. So you send the small groups away to come up with creative ideas. So we want better customer service. All right, so let's say we've got a team of 20 people. We send them away to 4 groups of 5 or 5 groups of 4, and each group comes up with clever ideas about how to improve their customer service. At the individual Mary Smith level, you might say, well, okay, what can you do? What are your options? And Mary Smith will come up with a couple of options. And as a coach, your responsibility is to say, well, look, let's think more broadly. What, even silly sounding ideas, let's get them out. And it's a good idea to get people to write those down. Now, at a group level, the plan, do, act, and review bit is that it's a good thing to get people to vote for the options people come up with. So you can imagine 5 groups have come up with suggestions about how to improve customer service. Stick them up on a wall and vote for them. You could use a single vote, which is everybody just votes for their favorite, or you could use something more complex, like 3 votes for your favorite, 2 for your second favorite, 1 for your third favorite. But then once that happens, you get members of that group to commit to those activities. So here are the 3 activities that got the highest levels of votes. Who's going to lead this process? Who's going to help this person? So you put together a team to do this thing to improve customer service, or different teams to do multiple things. And then you set timeframes and you build an accountability structure. This is a really effective thing to do. And as I say, using technologies like Zoom, you can certainly do this remotely. We found it extremely successful. By the way, from a personal learning point of view, I would have thought this stuff is very difficult to do remotely. 6 months ago, if I had thought I'll be doing this regularly remotely, I would have said, yeah, I don't believe so. But in fact, I've been surprised at how effective it is. I don't think it's quite as effective as doing it face-to-face, but it's pretty close. It's certainly way better than simply being top-down. So the path to engagement, leader behaviours, so this is the engagement of these 2,700 people that I mentioned earlier. Leader behaviours have a direct path to engagement, but quite a weak one. What we found in this research is that leader behaviours had a massive impact on colleague behaviours, and that in turn had a massive impact on the levels of engagement. So what leaders do is that they create colleague behaviours, and that leads to the engagement of all of the members of the team. Now, you can imagine if a person is doing this style of leadership, well, they're being a transformational leader, aren't they? They're being quite charismatic, as a matter of fact, by virtue of saying, I believe you guys can solve this problem. They're being optimistic. I know you can solve the problem. They're being supportive. You're reinforcing, hey, you guys, I value you. You can do this. And of course, what this also does is that it creates behaviors which will then be adopted by the group. And one of the things that people tell me all the time when they've started doing this is that staff become more independent. They start acting more as leaders, and that changes their behaviors. So instead of coming to the leader and say, save me, they tend to say, well, let's work out a solution and go to the leader for their thoughts rather than, solve our problem. Now, this then, of course, frees up the leader to do more true leadership stuff like stakeholder management, strategy, those kinds of things. So some summaries and conclusions. Firstly, the remote workforce does have risks from an engagement point of view. You need to recruit people who are suited to being remote workers, resilient, hardworking, stable people. You need to plan your leadership in ways which have not been so crucial when you have water cooler conversations. Remember, really key point from this presentation, proximal works, distal doesn't. Use that to guide your interactions. And use facilitative leadership when you can. It's a very, very powerful form of interaction. Now, at the back here, you have all of these references, which we can provide to you. If you want a copy of these slides, simply get in touch. We will provide those to you so that you can get access to that or any other information. Thanks very much for listening today. I hope all of this helps you in your task of remote leadership.